Hey, party people. I have Mariah back in the studio by popular demand. And so many of you loved her How to Sew 8 Common Seams video. You wanted her back. I brought her back. No, I like Mariah. We're just going to hang out, whatever. And so many of you asked for zipper sewing tutorials in my Zippers 101 video. So go ahead and watch those 2 videos to get yourself caught up. And take it away, Mariah.
Great. So we're going to sew a railroad separating zipper. So I went ahead and cut out just a fabric sample that we're going to use, and I have my nice separating zipper. Separates at the bottom. The first thing we want to do is just pre-press our hem and our neckline. So for my neckline, I'm just going to do about 1/2 inch. And I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And I went ahead and put my notches in so that it makes it easier for pressing. This is the front of your fabric. This is the top of the zipper stop where the bottom is going to be, how much hem you have. 1/4 inch roll, and then a 1 inch hem. So I went ahead and marked out my notches on here, so I have it for both sides. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to press. Just want to check it. Bottom, the same thing on the other side. And you can use a ruler for this. I can visually see measurements because I've been sewing for over a decade, but I highly advise if you guys are beginners to use a ruler to make sure that things are accurate so that you don't wind up with one piece slightly longer than the other. Double check my measurements along here that these are equal. Great, they line up beautifully. Using our regular foot, we can go ahead and do a basting stitch, the top angle of my garment. That's where I want to line up my zipper stop. So you'll see that I keep it folded over, essentially for the top hem to line it up. Then I just roll up and I'll stick a pin in. And that's just going to hold that in place. You'll notice that I have my fabric face up, my zipper face down, so that the edge of the zipper is going with the raw edge of the fabric. A lot of times students will unzip their zippers and try to do this with a single side, and it gets really confusing, and most of the time students sew zippers backwards the first time. So just always keep in mind the easiest way to sew zippers is to have it zipped, do your pinning, and then unzip. So now that mine's pinned up here, I know that it's facing the right way. Put pins all the way down.
Do you have a stitch length preference for this basting stitch?
So I usually turn it up. So your normal stitch length is 2.5. So I usually turn it up to 4.5 or 5, just a really wide stitch length for basting. The other thing that we want to pay attention to is we want to take the top part of our zipper and we want to fold it so that I do a fold so that it's a 90-degree angle this side of the zipper, and then fold down. So that way, when it's all hemmed, it's nice and clean. I'm just going to do a basting stitch at 1/4 inch seam allowance. I always start with my needle down, and then I'm just going to sew this basting stitch. And if you find that the head of your zipper is pretty thick and it's going to make you kind of curve your stitch, you can put your needle down, lift with your knee, and then just move your zipper out of the way. And you don't need to back stitch this or anything because this is just a base to hold it together momentarily. What we want to think about is from the front of the zipper, you want to have a nice clean edge to it, clean finish. So in order to get that, we need to keep the top folded under the top hem, and then we're going to fold it back on itself. So you can see the raw edge is still pointing up, but it's folded so that once it's sewn in, it's going to clean to the front. Okay? So again, if we pre-pressed it, a fold, fold hem, you're gonna unroll just one. Put your zipper in, and then roll it back on itself. So the raw edge is pointing out. I'm gonna do the same thing at the bottom. So before I pre-press my hem, I roll, roll. I'm gonna unroll one, turn it back on itself. I'm gonna sew this in at 3/8 of a seam allowance, so it's another 1/8 over from where our original basting stitch is. This is also going to be a basting stitch because we're going to top stitch at the end. So there will be a third line of defense. So we don't need to turn down our seam allowance or our stitch length and back stitch and all of that yet, because we're going to do that with the next round. My needle down, move my zipper out of the way. So now we can check it by flipping it over. Flip this corner, and you can see that it's nice and clean top to bottom. If my zipper is face up, my fabric is face down, because you want it to be face to face so that once it's sewn, it's nice and clean. So I'm gonna find my zipper notch on here and line it up to where I have it notched to the top line of the fabric. So where this fold line is where I want to make sure that the end of my zipper lines up so that they're even together. So you don't end up with this. You want to make sure that it lines up exactly at the bottom at that fold line. So I'm gonna. Okay, now that I've got my pins in, I can unzip. Okay, so I'm doing the same thing. I'm just gonna do a 1/4 of an inch basting stitch. And really, I did that to break it down for steps for you guys. You can actually just skip that initial basting stitch and go ahead and fold your hemline and do that all in one. But I'll do it step by step again.
Well, this will be good for like the very beginners, and then I think for most of us, as we get familiar with sewing these kinds of things, we will know ourselves what steps we can omit as we go.
And you'll pay attention that I did my little fold over again up here at the top. So now, remember we folded under. I'm gonna unroll one fold and fold it back on itself. Get it? Same up here. We fold it in and in. I'm gonna undo one, roll it back on itself, in. Just for added assurance, I like to double check one more time that that's the same length. So now I'm gonna sew this one in at my 3/8. Flip it, attach these, and see how it lines up. This is the point where you can still go back in and fix something if you need to. But the top lines up, the bottom lines up. Now that it's nice and clean, I want to go in and just give it a good solid press before I do any top stitching. And at this point, I know I'm going to forget to turn back down my seam allowance later, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it down because we're no longer doing basting stitches. Back down to 2.5. Now that I know that my angles are nice and clean, I can flip this back out and cut my corner. Notice that I'm not cutting to where my stitch line is. You don't want to cut through your stitch line. I'm just trimming that corner so that it's a little bit thinner in here and it sits a little flatter. But you'll notice how I didn't trim until I made sure that it lined up accurately on the front. Because once you cut, you can't uncut. Then if you cut too much, you got to go back and resew. And if you have extra zipper tape sticking out, you can just trim that down so it's not so bulky in your seam. So now we're ready to press. So I'm going to start by repressing this hem. You can see where my original press line was. I want to make sure that it's that it's pressed really clean before I sew this. And now on the front, I'm going to make sure that it lines up nice and flat, that it doesn't kind of wobble the stitch line, and give it a press.
It looks so nice.
Thank you.
I'm always going to be a clothing geek where I'm just like, when things come together and it starts looking all nice, I'm all like, hee hee hee.
So now we can come in and do our top stitch. Depending on how you want your garment to look, you can do an edge stitch right up along the edge of the seam. You could do, if it's a little bit more sporty or more utilitarian, sometimes you do a 1/4 of an inch top stitch. Just kind of depends what look you want, but my advice is to keep it consistent throughout your garment. So if you're doing an edge stitch on the center front, then you want to do an edge stitch on all the seams that you're stitching over. And just keep it really consistent. So it's not just like a weird garment where you have all different lengths. I'm just going to move my zipper out of the way. And I usually like to hand walk my, when I'm top stitching, I like to hand walk my machine for the first stitch or two to do the back stitch so it's not running off. And so I kind of control that first couple stitches more because you want it to be really clean when you're top stitching. I'm going to go really nice and slow to get it started. Okay, put my needle down, lift up the foot, move the zipper out of the way. And I like to go really nice and slow down at the bottom because you're coming up right next to the zipper stopper. So again, I kind of hand walk it with my hand a little bit so I can control that distance and that speed a little bit better. Back stitch. Now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Go down, I kind of control it with my hand to do the back stitch. When I'm sewing just a regular seam, I'll back stitch like normal. This is just if I'm working with extra thick fabric or if I'm doing top stitching, I want to have better control. Because surprise, surprise, I'm a patterning person. I'm a control freak. Comes with the nature. Now we have our hem to do. So I'm just going to pin this. So this would be when you're ready to hem the entire garment, which is usually the last step that you do. So if you were making this, if this were a jacket, you'd go ahead and you can put on your sleeves, you can put on your pockets, so all of that, and then typically the very end is the hem. So for this top one, I'm going to do my hem at 1/2 inch, and I'm going to start it right where the denim fabric starts. You don't want to start over here where your zipper is, because then it'll just create a new zipper stop. So don't sew over your zipper or your zipper teeth. Do it with your hand. Get started. For the bottom, I'm going to do 1 inch.
And of course, you know, hems and collars, they're up to your design. You know, Mariah's just doing kind of a basic one just so that she can give a good example of a nice, clean finish. I see a lot of zipper tutorials out there, and they just kind of leave them unfinished at the top and bottom, and so students don't know how to like fold the tape down and make things look neat. So that's basically what Mariah is showing, but you know, you can do all kinds of different hems and collars, and you can attach knit collars and different waistbands and things like that. But this was really to show the nice little fold over and sew that corner so that it looks really nice technique that Mariah has.
So now we have the top of our garment, bottom of our garment, and it separates. All right. So that is the separating railroad zipper.
Whoop, whoop.
So this is going to be our railroad zipper with a closed end. So your basic flat, non-invisible zipper. And I went ahead and just measured a seam allowance at the top, 1/2 inch, and I notched it. So if my zipper lines up with my zipper stop up here, I also notched at the bottom of my zipper stop. So I want to go ahead and sew from that zipper stop notch down, you know, whatever, if this were a skirt, if this were pants, you're sewing down to the end of the garment. So for this type of zipper, you want to sew a wider seam allowance. So I'm going to sew at 3/4.
And this is right side to right side?
Sorry, yes. So it's face to face. And I'm going to start sewing at the notch. My needle in. And I like to hand walk the first 2 stitches to back stitch cleanly and sew down to the end. So now I want to press my seam allowance at 3/4 inch all the way up. So I'm actually going to make it easier on myself, and I'm going to go ahead and notch it at the top at 3/4 inch as well. So I'm going to start by pressing open the bottom where my seam is, and then I'm going to continue that press all the way up. And you can also, just so your measurements are correct, you can kind of check. You want to make sure that that your press line or your seam allowance is very accurate on the zipper. It's the difference between the zipper looking good and looking really messy or cheap is having an accurate press line. Your iron has so much steam, I feel like I'm getting a facial.
Yeah, when I do a haul of my husband's shirts, I'll do 8 to 10 of them at a time.
You put on a face mask first, so you just really open up your pores?
I just get that steam facial going. I look so dewy when I'm done. It's like I did a sheet mask.
Exactly. So you want to line it up exactly as if it were sewn all together in a seam. So now I'm going to take my zipper. I'm going to put it face down where these notches are. That's where my zipper stop is going to line up. And this is really important. It needs to, your zipper teeth need to sit exactly on the seam. Go through and make sure that the center of my zipper lines up exactly on the seam. And I'm going to stick some pins in. So for the other side, I'm just going to match it exactly. Make sure that it's closed. Stick some pins in. So you just adjust as you go until, and sometimes actually it's a little bit harder to do with the zipper head, so you can move that out of the way. Keep lining it up. I'm just going to take a needle and thread.
I didn't knot it.
And you don't need to knot it or anything. And I'm just going to do a quick basting stitch. This is just going to hold it together temporarily. And this may seem like an unnecessary step, and you can get to a point where you don't do this and you just trust that you lined it up perfectly and pinned it perfectly. But I find this is easier to sew if you don't have pins in the way. So I'm just doing like a 1/2 inch in, 1/2 inch out, simple basting stitch. We're going to take this out at the end, so it doesn't need to be beautiful, perfect stitches. I also like to look, here I can go through, look on the other side and make sure that I know right where my stopper is. Because we're going to stitch around, I don't want to sew directly on top of my stopper because that's going to break, it's metal, so it's going to break your needle. So you want to go either 1/8 of an inch above or 1/8 of an inch below. So I'm just going to put my basting stitch 1/8 of an inch below so that I know where I'm going to sew that line. So now we want to go in, unzip it halfway. You can decide again how wide you want to go with your seam allowance. I'm going to do about 3/8 seam allowance around the edge. You could do it a little bit closer. Sometimes you get, sometimes when you get closer to the teeth, you can have a little bit of an issue down at the stopper. So I err on the side just slightly wider. Once I get pretty far down, I'm going to put my needle down, lift up your foot, zip around it, and then keep sewing nice and straight. And I went ahead with my basting stitch and marked where I wanted to turn. So I'm going to come right up to there, put my needle down, pivot, turn. This I'm going to walk with my hand just so I can control where it stops so I don't go too far. Put my needle down, pivot, and turn. Do the same thing. And put my needle down. That's it. So it's clean on here. So now I can go and just pull out my basting stitch. So we have a zipper all the way around, set in.
And that cut edge is ready to go into a waistband. Yes. Or...
And you can just do a final iron so it's nice and flat. Okay.
Awesome. All right, those were your 2 railroad zip tutorials by the amazing Mariah. Round of applause. Woo! Cheerleading backstage right here. You know the drill. Zippers can be difficult, and Mariah is only able to do these beautiful zippers because she's been sewing for, what you said, over a decade.
Yeah.
And that means practice. So hashtag always be practicing. Hashtag practice not magic. Drop your questions for me or Mariah in the comment section below. More zipper tutorials are coming. If you want them, drop me comments. All that good stuff, and give us a big thumbs up if you learned something new today, and I will see you in the next video.